What's up, guys? It's Stamp. So I'm gonna talk to you guys today about one of the most asked questions I get on stream, and I can't take all the credit for this information. There's been a lot of people who have helped from the community, so I'll list them over the course of the next few videos that I'm gonna make. Is I'll talk about who's influenced them, and if they have a channel, I'll link you to some of their content. So we'll go ahead and get started with kind of the target and the objective of this. So the objective of this is for me to show you what is most commonly considered amongst the group of players that are pretty high level, the meta. I've done a lot of research. I've talked to a lot of people. I have all this stuff myself until you get to the post 30, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I've used a variety of different setups and combos, and these are what I consider the best. So there's a few caveats before we get started that I really want to talk about. If you're a newer level player or a mid-level player, some of these things don't take place until, I would say, your mid-20s or possibly when you start to fish at Bear Lake. So as we look at these combos that I'm going to give you, I'm running the line just under the strength of the rod. What happens is your rod is probably going to wear faster than the line if you're using the line that I'm going to recommend. So you've got to be very careful in watching that as your rod starts to deteriorate, your rod then becomes the breaking point, because the line you're running is essentially going to be stronger than your rod. So keep that in mind. The second thing is the meter on the bottom of the screen, which I'd have to, walk all the way to the water. I'm not going to do. You guys know the meter that has green, yellow, orange, red. As you look at that meter, that is not the breaking strength of your line. That is the breaking strength of whatever the lowest common denominator or the weakest point of your setup is. It might be your hook. It's probably not, because your hook's cheap. It might be your rod. It more than likely is your rod if your line's worn and you're running really heavy line. It could be your reel, depending on how balanced your setup or unbalanced your setup is. So it could be any of those things. So keep that in mind. It's very unlikely that it's your hook unless you're using very, very low quality hooks. So you're probably not, because you got tired of fish got away at this point and you bought the best hooks, or you bought really good hooks. So it's probably not your hook. Odds are it's your line or it's your rod. So be careful with this as we go through these setups, because the combinations I'm going to give you are going to be, they're going to be run really right up to the edge. So pay particular attention to that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with level 16, because level 16 is where I would say, I guess the phrase would be, the rubber meets the road. You get to Kuori, you're looking for setups to catch some burbot, to catch some char. You begin to get a bigger reel because you want to start doing spin fishing for some of the lake trout and the char that are there, whether it's an Arctic char, Kuori char, whatever it might be, maybe the pike. So we're going to talk primarily about feeders and picker rods, because that's most commonly utilized across the community. I'll talk a little bit about spinning rods and how they kind of match up as we go through. At the very end, I'll kind of go through your spinning setups as well, but this is primarily for feeder and picker rods. At the end, I'll throw out what I feel are the best rods to buy for spinning as well, just to make sure I hit on both points. So we're going to start with feeder rods. So at level 16, you unlock the Saber 60. So let's take a look at the reels, because this is the first reel you're going to unlock. And what these reels and rods, these setups are essentially, is what I feel and most of the higher level players feel are best dollar per dollar, pound for pound, kilogram for dollar, I guess is a good way to say, setups to get the most bang for your buck. You're not going to have any 5-star reels in here. This isn't about the highest quality reels or whatever it might be. This is about making sure that you have the best item per kilogram that you can possibly afford, and you're going to run that with the right rod. So we're going to start with the Saber 60. This unlocks at level 16. Max drag on a Saber 60 is 10 kilogram. So as we look at all the lines that are going to be utilized, I'm basing it off of this hybrid braid. Reason being, I've tried Devil Braid, I've tried Extra Silk. I don't think it makes a difference. As a matter of fact, I think Devil Braid wears a hell of a lot faster than any of the braided lines. But looking at now that may or may not be true, it just seems to be my experience. So looking at the hybrid line that I'm going to recommend with this is we're going to run just about 12.5 kilogram. So this is bigger than the reel. Again, it's heavier than the reel, I guess I would say. You have 0.24 millimeters. If we look at the reel, 0.24 millimeters is going to give you even over the smallest line capacity that's stated on the reel. So you're going to get more than 200 meters of line. The reason why I didn't go to 0.28 or I didn't go a little bit heavier is it's not going to make that big of a difference on this small of a reel. It's really not. And at 12.5 kilogram, you can use one of the rods that I feel is a little better pound for pound than going up and spending and just getting a bigger rod, which I feel would create a little bit of an unbalanced setup. So you're going to get, in all these setups, I'm looking at a minimum 200 meters of line. So ideally you don't get spooled in some of the bigger places, but you guys use whatever you want as far as line. But just keep in mind, if you're running line heavier than your drag, be very careful with that, because again, what's your breaking point at that point? Is it going to be your reel? Is it your rod? I mean, we kind of already talked about that. So looking at the Saber 60, this is the reel we're going to utilize at level 16. Then we're going to go to our rods, and we're going to take a look at our rods. So go to the feeder rods, and the one I'm going to recommend is just under, it's going to be just under, or just over rather, 12.5 kilograms at 13 kilograms. So the FD120, we're going to choose over the FD150. And the main thing you guys will see as you go through and you look at my recommendations is I am not picking the longer rod. The longer rod for me carries a bigger negative to it, in that I don't feel you need to throw, you don't need to cast to China to catch a lot of fish. You don't need the additional spinning reel skill, and I'll talk about that in another video, but you don't need the bigger setup of the rods, in my opinion. So these are basically the same rod. This one here is a little bit longer. So we're going to recommend the FD120. It saves you a few bucks. You don't really need the casting distance anywhere you're going to be fishing with this. Truthfully, I don't know that you need extra casting distance on any rod to fish anywhere currently in the game. So we've got the Saber 60, the FD120 rather, and then you have the 12.5 kilogram line in the hybrid black or green series, whichever one you want to run. Looking at a picker rod for that same reel, I can tell you guys it's one of my favorite setups in the game. Is you can utilize, there's the Model 2. This is my favorite rod that I have. The Model 2, the load capacity goes up to 11.5 kilogram. I am still using this to fish on Kaori for burbot and for char. So this would be a great rod. If you want to go a little bit heavier, you could go to the Model 1, the 240. And what that'll give you it'll go up to 15.5 kilograms. So you get a little more as far as pound for pound. The advantage to the Model 2 picker is you get the additional skill in bait fish, meaning, or in bottom fishing, meaning at 80% you could fish for bait fish. I wouldn't recommend it. I have tried it. I would not recommend doing that. But it does unlock some of the other skills a little bit faster, only on that particular rod. So for example, if you were at 30% and you had this Model 2 picker, you could use paternoster rigs. So keep that in mind. This is one of my favorite rods that I have. Probably my favorite rod to fish for char and burbot on. I seem to get bit way more on my picker rods than I do on my feeder rods. Just keep that in mind. And I don't have any skills in picker rod at all. I have 7 points in feeder rod. Not that that would matter, but just throwing it out there in case you would have said that. So that's for the Saber 60. At level 20, you're able to go to Volkov. So you're looking at the possibility of running into some catfish. You've got the Atlantic salmon. Obviously, Bear Lake opens at 18. I would not recommend going there until you're much better kitted. At least gold 60s or 80s. I would recommend 80s, but you can do it with 60s. But anyway, so let's talk a little bit about the Siberia Gold 60S and the 80S. So these are the same reel outside of the line capacity. So this 6,000 is the size of the reel, meaning basically the size of the spool. Gear ratios are the same, so you're going to use the same rotation on a 60S and an 80S to get the jig step, to get twitching, whatever it might be. You're going to use the same speeds because they're going to be identical. The difference is the line capacity. So let's see what so 0.36 is 224 meters of line on the 80S. 0.36 is 147 meters of line on the 60S. So 75 meters of line, give or take, is going to be the difference between these two. It's not a huge deal, but as you look at running some of the bigger lines, I would much rather have an 80S than a 60. But if you look at the price difference, consider your budget. If you're upgrading from a Saber 60 to a Gold Series reel, you're 1/4 of the way towards another one. If you're fishing Kuori, I mean, you're never going to buy it here because it's super expensive, but you're well on your way towards another Gold 60. So you may go Saber 60 to 3 Gold 60s and then go, a Gold 80, knock off one of the 60s. Completely up to you, but at level 20 you have access to both. So my recommendation is you're going to run the 15 kilogram braided line. Doesn't have to be this color, obviously. So you're going to run this 35-pound line for the Gold 60. At the Gold 80, you're going to run 19 kilogram line. So not much difference in price. It's simply, how strong the line will be. So what this takes us to is a split in the rods that you're going to use for these reels. So you have the Percy FD 110, which I still use right now, as a matter of fact, as a third rod to fish for a little bit of a lighter species like some of the brim, fishing for barbel or things like that in Bear Lake. Not trying to target carp, but it would be able to take carp if you hooked it. So this is a 16.5 kilogram rod for load capacity on this rod. If you look at the 140, same 16.5, same test, just difference is the line length. So you don't need to pay the extra money for that unless you really want to, or the rod length rather. Looking at the picker rods for that reel, it would be the exact same. So you'd use either the Model 1 240 that we talked about, or the Model 2 that I showed you guys before. Now the difference here comes into when you have a Gold 80, you're going to go to the Fortuna Feeder 420 unless you're sitting on money. If you're sitting on money at that point, you're going to go looking at the Model 2 or Model 1 feeders at that point. So the big difference here between the Model 2 and the Model 1, there isn't a ton of it. A lot of people still use either one of these at the mid-20s. What you'll find as you get higher level is that the weight of the rod is where a lot of the difference is. So if you see where it says weight, I'm going to tell you why that matters, because it factors into some of the decisions I make later on with the higher level gear. And this is kind of getting sidetracked, but it's important. The higher the weight is, the faster your energy goes down. It doesn't matter so much while you're fighting char and burbot. That really doesn't matter. But if you're fighting a bigger Kuori char, a bigger lake trout, any of the carp species, catfish, sturgeon, weight matters because it depletes your energy. So long term, what that means is you got to buy more food, you got to buy more tea, you got to buy more coffee, more mulled wine. You got to have more of those things in order to make up for it. So as you're making your decision based off what I'm recommending, keep that in mind and utilize that to help you make your decision. The extra capacity in the rod may not be as good as having a lighter rod in order to fight some of the fish. So looking at, again, going back to the Gold 80, the Fortuna FD 420 is a 19.5 kilogram rod. So this will bring you up until really Bear Lake. I could fish this at Bear Lake. I really wouldn't want to. I'd rather go to almost a 30 kilogram rod. I can run some of the higher line and I can stop some of the mid-size or the small to mid-size carp from running and to catch fish faster. That's the big reason why I run heavier braided line. I feel I'm able to stop the fish faster and get them in and go back out and, recast and catch more fish at a faster rate. So the Fortuna FD 420 is what we'd recommend as far as a feeder rod. Then on a picker rod standpoint, this changes a little bit in that you would use the Model 1 and you would use the Model 1 270M, which is a 22 kilogram rod Again, look how light that is in comparison. Obviously, the cost is almost double, but a much lighter rod that's even has a higher load capacity. So another option for you there. So at 26, this is going to probably spark some debate. At this point in your, let's say, Russian fishing for career, so to speak, you probably can acquire 3,000 to 5,000 silver fairly quickly. And by quickly, I'm going to put that in air quotes and say a few days time, maybe a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on your play time. But it's not as crazy to think about, man, 5,000 silver, that's a long way away when you were 16 and 20. When you start to fish at Bear Lake, or you have a couple good days at Kaori with some cafe orders, it becomes a real possibility that at level 26, you can get some of the fancier rods. So the most common question that I get is, what about the Mayor? So it's 19 kilogram rod, it's 6,000 silver. I could get this kind of easily. You know, talk me out of it. Why wouldn't I get it? Well, I'm not going to talk you out of it if you're spin fishing, because it's a great reel for spin fishing. There aren't a ton of species that are going to be over 19 kilogram. I mean, the real big Kaori chars could be, but really spinning is not going to be your issue. It's feeder fishing, sturgeon, catfish, carp, and I'm going to show you why. So if you're looking at buying the Mayor, here's the deal. Let's look at, okay, so the only thing here, let's say 0.30 millimeters is at 200 meters a line. So we're going to look at that. We're going to say, man, how big is that line? So we're going to go here, and we go over here, and we go, oh, well, wait, this is 15 kilogram line. The drag is heavier than that. So I can use 15 kilogram line then. Okay. So this is the same line that we're using on our Gold 60. You're just paying 5 times as much for that reel. Now, given you're getting a little bit of power and that it's 19 kilogram, the reason I say you can use it in spinning is when you're trolling, a lot of times you don't need a ton of line. Now, yeah, I don't know that you need 110 meters, but you might be able to get away with it on a spinning setup. And as long as you aren't running into a catfish or something that's super heavy in some of the lakes, you'll probably be okay. However, I'd much rather save that and put it towards the Everest 8,000 when you get to 26. So I'll look at the rebuttal that I often get. Well, what about, you know, damn, what if I get the Everest 6,000? You know, this is 5,000. It's half the money. It's 16.5 kilogram. I mean, that's pretty good, right? And we run into the same damn problem that we had on the other one. You're still only using 15 kilogram line. Is it a good reel? Yeah, it is. Again, for spinning, it's really good. Dollar per dollar, though, you're probably better off buying a bait caster than buying this. So if we look at some of the higher end bait casters, this one's really popular as far as the meta and a decent cost of a bait caster. And you can go way past that, almost to this, which is one of the best reels in the game. Now, given this is a level 30 reel, but for that same money, the point I'm making is you can almost go all the way there. So keep that in mind as you're making that decision. The Everest is, in my opinion, the best feeder reel in the game. I now have 2 of them, and I'm going to dispel some of the notions and myths that I hear. Is it's really expensive to repair. So I've owned the reel since Christmas. I have a ton of hours on it. Let me show you guys. I got to find which rod I left it on. Don't laugh at my gear. It's really banged up right now. It's because I just bought another Everest. But, okay. So I've owned it since Christmas. I'll show you what I've repaired so far. I've repaired the mechanism once. This was about 1,300 silver. It was expensive. It was a beating. But that was once in almost 3 months. Now I got to repair it again when it gets down to about 30, so I'm almost due for another repair. The friction brake I have not repaired, but the price is about 400 silver. The grease, when I repair this, is about $4. So FYI, all those negative connotations you hear are people that do not own it, they don't understand it, and they don't know what they're talking about. There's a lot of rumors and misinformation that's been spread about the reel. It's still, in my opinion, the best reel in the game because it gives you the ability to catch not only spinning, but you can also do feeder fishing. So to catch the big carp, to catch some of the big sturgeon. Now, the sturgeon you can get on bait casting reels. Same thing for some of the bigger catfish. You can get them on some of those bigger bait casting reels. But odds are you're going to be feeder fishing for them. And when you are, that's the reel you want to take. So let me give you some recommendations, because this always comes up when you talk about the Everest. How do you get one? You abandon spin fishing for the most part. It's not as good as what some people say, in my opinion. Kuori is probably the best place to go to spin fish for the most part. But Kuori can die, and Kuori can be full of perch. And you can waste day after day after day. In my opinion, the most consistent place is Bear Lake. Occasionally, if the weather's good on Sura, you can do really well on some of those sturgeon. But you can also sit there for days at a time and not catch some of those sturgeon. And the zander that are near the sturgeon spots, sometimes they aren't there too. Day in and day out, 4660 at Bear Lake is probably the most consistent spot. If you're not catching fish with the boilies you're using, switch, you'll probably get bit almost instantly. That's the best spot currently in the game for XPN money. So, after going through all of that, I'm going to show you what you're going to run on the Everest. Again, dollar per dollar. So, to get 200 meters of line on the Everest, we're looking at using 33 kilogram which is the 72-pound line. Now, you can see it's out of stock. It's probably out of stock for a reason. A lot of people buy this line that they run on their Everest. A lot of the higher level players, that's the line they're running. Some of the higher ended braids, you can actually run heavier line and get the same line capacity to get 200 meters. That's what I'm recommending, but don't be afraid to go down, you know, a little bit to a 25 is fine, the 25 kilogram. Truthfully, it doesn't, I don't think it matters as much as what people say. I wouldn't run a 19, but I'd run a 25 or I'd run a 33. You don't have to go up to anything bigger than that. As we look at the rod we recommend, so we did a lot of testing, and I have to make sure to say thanks to Crossy. Him and I have tried a lot of the higher end feeder rods, and he's given me a lot of really good feedback and information. So I own the Wingate. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. You guys probably saw it in my inventory. I'm going to show you why I hate it, and hopefully you can see like in one quick second. See that? Like a wet noodle out there. Awful. Awful. It doesn't have the backbone that I thought it should have for being that type of a reel. So looking at the Wingate series, people go, oh wow, you get an additional point towards feeder fishing. So looking at, you know, any of these, you can see +1 to the feeder fishing, feeder rod. These are 33, 34 kilogram rods. They're nice rods. The action's fast, and they're just like a wet noodle. Now, you might say, okay, well, you have 7 of 7, so you have 8 of 7. While I'm using this rod, I still lose fish. And normally the fish I lose are really big. So having 8 of 7 in a feeder rod, I'm still losing fish. It's not worth the money to go out and get that rod. And the Coldstream is a much better rod as far as the backbone of the rod goes, and it's gonna be more for sure, but it's worth the money. So it becomes a 4-star rod, so it's not gonna take as much damage as a 3.5-star rod would. And the one we're gonna utilize is the 130H, and I'll kind of explain why. Same situation going on here. You're getting 36 kilogram. Basically you're looking at the same stats, everything. This is just a little bit longer. As you look at the rod itself, 36 kilogram, the weight is 298 on that rod. Now, I see people that say 33.5. They're good with that. They're not going to run that heavy of a line, so they're going to run this rod. That's perfectly fine. That rod's great, and it's lighter, which means you're going to recover some of your energy a little bit better. So if you look at these, and you look at some of their weight, 344, 386, 308, and this one's 32.5. And then you compare that to Coldstream, 298, you know, 250, and then this one's 316. So that's going to mean that you're going to regenerate energy at a quicker rate in some of those longer fights. You won't deteriorate nearly as much energy using a heavier rod. So the picker rod that you would utilize for that setup would be the Royal PM 98H. So this is a level 30 rod, so keep that in mind as you're looking at some of these. The advantage is that they give you plus 10% to bottom fishing. So if you are 75% in bottom fishing and you have this rod, you can throw bait fish on this picker rod. Not anything else, but on that rod you could. And that's just to go really heavy. If you really want to go heavy, that's what we felt the best setup. If you happen to choose the Mayor, I hope you don't, but if you do, or you already have it, then here's the setup to use. The Model 2 FD 360. That's the setup for the Mayor. If you decided you want to go to a picker rod, you could go back to the Model 1 series, and then the Model 1 300 is what you'd use. So there's going to be a lot of debate about the higher-ended reels, guys, and if they're worth it, if they're not. They are worth it to get. Once you get to the Everest, it's absolutely worth it. I'll tell you, I now have 2 of them. They make Bear Lake much more bearable, no pun intended. But you can catch a lot of those 5, 6, 7 kilogram carp. You just shift reel and hold your rod up and you'll pull them in. Meaning you're going to catch more fish at a faster rate. You're going to get better experience more quickly. And that's it. I mean, it's a really good rod. So, or reel rather. So if we look at the last thing, as you get to kind of mid, I guess I would call this late game, you get to right around level 30, and you're looking at what your next investment's going to be. It's probably going to be this Dominator. So by 90%, you unlock carp rods. These, I shouldn't say that Dominator, but this series of rods is where you're going to look at it, look at making your next purchase. And again, consider weight. It's a factor. Consider how big, you know, 46 kilogram, 51 and a half, 48. Do you need 51 and a half? Maybe. It's completely up to you guys, whichever one of the series you're going to go to is. But this is probably where you're going as soon as you get to 32, if you're still feeder fishing. So most of the higher end players you'll see, if you watch streams like 37, 38s, they're running 3 of these rods. They're basically considered, I would guess, the best rods in the game. Dollar per dollar, I feel the best rod in the game currently because of the size of the fish is the Coldstream, the 130 that we showed you. So, but any of the series of Coldstream can work depending on what you want. So I'm going to talk kind of briefly about the same piece when we talk about spinning rods. So as we look at spinning rods, same thing. You get to level 16. What are you looking for? This is a great rod. This is a really, really good rod for the money. This would be the S78 MH. I still use this when I'm fishing for some of the smaller species. It's a great rod at 14 kilograms. It's awesome. So you'll probably still, this is great for Kuori. Do keep in mind, don't run it into the ground. Don't run line that's super close. Don't run a 13 kilogram line on this because you'll run into some lake trout, some pike, maybe some Cory char that'll beat up your rod a little bit. So you probably want to be a little lighter on it. But this is a great rod to start out with the Saber 60. Now when you get to the Gold 60, there's a couple different options. Now these rods are actually really good for the money. We're going to look at this one to be paired up with the Gold 60 just from a saving standpoint. But you can also run the bigger linear, the 88. This one here goes to 15 and a half. So again, it depends on, I'm looking at rod and reel balance and trying to balance them out for you guys a little bit better. There's nothing saying that you can't put this with a Saber 60 for sure. As we look at some of the other ones and you're ready to upgrade from there, a lot of people run the Super Duty. I do. You guys saw it there. I run it, but I don't spin fish a lot. You can run the Super Duty S78H, which is 24 and a half. You can run that. You can also run the Model 1, which is a great reel, dollar per dollar. or great rod rather, dollar per dollar, S78M. So the S78M goes to 23.5. Both of those are going to take you really where you need to go. Beyond that, some of these are really just, they do some fancy things and they're okay. Like you look at the Evora, it's 40 kilogram, you get extra casting distance. But similar to how we looked at the Coldstream, and once you get to a certain point, the rods aren't head and shoulders better than the other things, even though you're paying a lot more money. So I'm not going to say you do or don't need any of these ones beyond the Model 1, but the Model 1 will take you really up until late and end game. I don't personally feel you need anything over 25 to 29 kilograms unless you're going to target some of the sturgeon and catfish, and I don't know that I'd recommend spinning to do that. I would tell you probably to go bait casting, but like the Barracudas, they go up to 95 kilograms. So again, completely up to you guys. You decide you really want to invest in spinning, but if you're just looking for a few ideas as you get into spinning, or you're going to supplement your feeder fishing with spinning, that's what you're going to utilize. So one last thing I want to talk about, this rod particular is really good. So as you look at jigging, so jigging's a little unique, and if you fish Sura, you will probably hook up with some catfish rarely, or possibly some sturgeon or sterlet rarely, but catching Zander and catching Volga Zander on Sura can be really profitable. And these have one additional point in jigging, and they're very low cost. Now, they're only a 2-star rod. Keep that in mind. But this series of rods, if you decide you want to fish for Zander and Volga Zander, and you can find a really good spot, these rods for me have been very, very good, dollar per dollar. Now, later in the game, you can get the, what is it, the Armada? Is this it? Yeah, the Armada that gives you 2 points to jigging, which would be realistically even better, but look at the cost too. They're 10 times as much. So anyway, that was a lot. I know that this is a really long video, so I apologize for the length, guys. I hope it helps you though, because I get this question asked a lot, and I really just wanted to make a video because every time I get asked it, normally I get it repeated in another hour, an hour and a half while I'm streaming. So I wanted to go through and do this. So special thanks to Crossy. I'm going to link his YouTube and his Twitch channel down below, guys, because he helped with a lot of this information. Mac, G, Hendrix, if you guys are out there, thank you for all your help and your contributions for some of the data that I asked for. Frankie as well. So thanks, guys, for watching. I appreciate it. I'm sorry it ran so long. Hopefully it helps you. Look for some more RF4 videos coming over the next couple days. Thanks. See ya.